Good morning, everyone. I have power. Well, I have microphone power. I don't know that I have any other kind of power. I got volume. Yeah, he's trying to start. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. It's great to hear everybody fellowshipping, talking together. Please continue that after class and after service. We are continuing our study of Ezekiel. If you want to turn over to the last section, or what I'm calling the last section, chapters 40 through 48. We're looking at it as more of a group, not a chapter by chapter study, because of the way I look at it. That's just really what it comes down to, and how it's structured. Remember, one of the unique features of chapters 40 through 48 is the content is all part of a vision. It's all part of one vision. I've been gone for a couple of weeks, so I appreciate Jimmy filling in last week in your study on the altar. The heart is the altar. And then we had the Mount Dora presentation. Seems like more than 2 weeks. Feels like I've been gone a long time. I don't know if you feel that way. It's like, oh, he's back. No. But in the last class I was with you, we basically went through chapter 40, looking at the outer courtyard, the elements, some of the dimensions there. And what we're still looking at right now, and I think we'll get through it today, is the structural elements. Okay, this vision, the dimensions, the measurements, this place, this thing that Ezekiel was shown. And we'll begin to transition to some understanding of, from the perspective of Ezekiel and the exiles, what this means for them, at least what we think it means based on Scripture, or could mean. And then from there, transition further to us, because there's more to just this image of this place of worship for them. There are certainly implications for us and meanings for us that would be somewhat different than their understanding as we think about Christ and the new covenant. So there is method to the madness as we go through this. So if you'll bear with me, I think we'll get there. So again, chapter 40 primarily includes the dimensions of the temple, of the gateways, the inner courtyard, or the outer courtyard. Then we move on into the inner courtyard, the dimensions of those porticos. And at the end of chapter 40, going into chapter 41, you have the measurements of the new temple building specifically. And that's where we're going to begin with today. Just as a transition, Ezekiel 40, verse 47. This gives us the dimensions of the temple area itself. Then he measured the court. It was square, 100 cubits long, 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. The altar was in front of the temple. So from the bigger picture, we're going to hone in on the more narrower part of the temple. And the area that 100 by 100 is outlined loosely. I looked at this after the fact and said, that's not a square, that's more like a rectangle. So whoever drew the picture didn't quite have the visual right, but that's okay, that's not what we're worried about. But that square, that 100 by 100 cubits would translate to 175 by 175 feet, pretty big area. And the altar was in front of the temple, and that's the red circle there showing us the positioning of the altar. Now, we don't actually get information about the altar itself until get into chapter 43, which Jimmy actually shared with you last week. Use that as his opening to his lesson. And I want to come back to those verses in chapter 43, verses 13 through 17. And I'm going to actually read this section from the New Living Translation because I want to get to the feet instead of the cubits, just so you get a sense of the dimensions. That's the reason I'm going to use this particular translation this morning. So reading about the altar. These are the measurements of the altar. There's a gutter all around the altar, 21 inches deep, 21 inches wide, with a curb 9 inches wide around its edge. And this is the height of the altar. From the gutter, the altar rises 3.5 feet to a lower ledge that surrounds the altar and is 21 inches wide. From the lower ledge, the altar rises 7 feet to the upper ledge that is also 21 inches wide. The top of the altar, the hearth, rises another 7 feet higher with a horn rising up from each of the 4 corners. The top of the altar is square, measuring 21 feet by 21 feet. The upper ledge also forms a square, measuring 24.5 feet by 24.5 feet, with a 21-inch gutter and a 10.5-inch curb all around the edge. There are steps going up the altar, up the east side of the altar. Again, thanks to those that have a bit more imagination and visual creativity than I do, just an idea of what something like this might look like with the various dimensions. So the gutter or the base is that very lower level, and that first lower ledge, 3.5 feet tall. And that's where I've tried to position the circles. I'm not sure how well I did, but that first area, 3.5 feet, then the next ledge, 7.5 feet, then the upper part, 7 feet, then the upper part also 7 feet. Fairly tall. You stop and think about it, what they're doing, you're getting to. The top area, 21 by 21, then that lower edge, 24.5 by 24.5, and the steps going up the side. And just for a simple comparison, the altar from Solomon's temple was actually slightly larger than this one. It wasn't quite as tall. Well, it probably was. It says 15 by 15. I question that as I kept going back and running the numbers. I think Ezekiel's was slightly taller, but maybe I'm wrong. So don't take that to the bank. But at any rate, the dimensions of the width in every element seem to be consistent with Solomon's being slightly taller, but it really doesn't matter. So just take that and put it off to the side. All right, so this would be the altar in front of this temple space. Okay, let's go back now and look at the temple structure itself. We're going to pick up in chapter 40, verse 48. And I'm staying in the New Living Translation just to deal with the feet instead of the cubits. So chapter 40, verse 48. Then he brought me to the entry room of the temple. He measured the walls on either side of the opening to the entry room, and they were 8 3/4 feet thick. The entrance itself was 24.5 feet wide, and the walls on each side of the entrance were 5 1/4 feet long. The entry room was 35 feet wide, 21 feet deep. There were 10 steps leading up to it with a column on each side. So looking at just the structure itself, and this is not a great picture, but I couldn't really find one that I was satisfied with. So in my mind, what's this supposed to look like? I couldn't find one that I thought was very good, so we're just going to go with this one. So we get the image. Okay, so we've got the altar in front, steps leading up, and then you've got 10 steps up, and then you go into this entry point of this building itself. And you know, it's 10 steps leading up to it. The entry room was 35 feet wide, 21 feet deep. Sorry about that. The entire building we'll see is 35 feet wide, okay, for this temple structure. And then there's 3 different distinct elements of it. You have the entry here first, then we'll see the inner sanctuary, or the sanctuary, and then the inner sanctuary, or nave, inner nave, depending on the terms that you find in your translations. And we'll see it going back. So it's just a fairly wide, long building as far as its structure in itself. And we see that in the next part of verse 40, or in chapter 41, with the sanctuary or nave, and then the inner room or the inner nave. So picking up in chapter 41, verse 1. After that, the man brought me into the sanctuary of the temple. He measured the walls on either side of its doorway, and they were 10.5 feet thick. The doorway was 17.5 feet wide, and the walls on each side of it were 8 3/4 feet long. The sanctuary itself was 70 feet long and 35 feet wide. Okay, so this is the first room in the building. Then he went beyond the sanctuary into the inner room. He measured the walls on either side of its entrance, and they were 3.5 feet thick. The entrance was 10.5 feet wide, and the walls on each side of the entrance were 12 1/4 feet long. The inner room of the sanctuary was 35 feet long and 35 feet wide. This, he told me, is the most holy place. So again, we should be familiar with both the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. You have this inner room, the sanctuary or the nave, depending on your translation. It's 70 feet long, so it's twice as long as the most holy place or the inner nave, which was only 35 feet long. But again, the whole element was 35 feet wide as we look at it. There's some more details about the temple itself that we're not going to read through, but I'll give you a quick overview. You're welcome to go through and look at the details yourself in verses 15 through 26 of chapter 41. What I call the decor of these 2 spaces. All the walls were paneled with wood, as were the frames of the windows. There were windows in this structure. The nave in the most holy place had double doors. Just a quick side note. I think that's interesting from the tabernacle, where you have the curtain. And in the New Testament, focuses on the tearing of the curtain. Of course, this building we know was never actually constructed. But it was pictured with doors. I don't know if there's any significance or meaning to that at all. It was with double doors. Okay. And then the walls and the doors all have carved images of cherubim, and each cherubim had the face of a man and the face of a young lion, and then images of palm trees. I didn't really point this out as we were looking at some of the early elements of structure around the courtyard and the porticos. They also had panelings and these images of trees and palm trees particularly. I don't think the porticos have the cherubim in them. I think it's just palm trees. And I'll admit it right now, I did not dig into the imagery of, or the meaning of the imagery of palm trees and cherubim. I suspect there is something there, but I did not go into that over the past few weeks. All right, so then in verses 5 to 15 of chapter 41, so before you get into all this information of the decor, there's information about the rooms around this temple structure. Now, let me go back real quick. There's some other spacing, and the text is going to provide information about what is around the building itself. And you got to be paying attention to the reading and realize, oh, he's moved outside the building. There's something different here. This is not inside. And so that's what falls into place in verses 5 to 15 of chapter 41. And that's one of the reasons I've been I've been going through this approach to trying to show the structures and where they fit, because the explanations in the scripture kind of jump around a little bit. And I've been working on an outline that I'm going to hopefully have for you next week to kind of show in these chapters is really what I'm going to call two really distinct types of content. There's all these measurements and descriptions in the vision, and then there's instructions. Okay, God's directions for the people, for Ezekiel, the exiles, and elements that we can learn from. But they're all intermixed until we get to the very latter chapters. That are very instructional oriented. But at this point, there's a bit of a mixing. And so if you're following through, it's like he's jumping around a lot. I am, because the presentation jumps around just a little bit. Susan?
Interested in the measurements on the sanctuary. I've kind of measured this auditorium, but it looks like the sanctuary is slightly smaller than our auditorium.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I thought a few weeks ago I should come in with a measuring tape. How wide is this space? I don't know how wide this space is either. But I suspect you're right. Because you think 35 feet is, okay, you think, well, that's big. It's really not that far. And it's not a huge space. Neither was the tabernacle, okay? Not a huge structure in and of itself physically. Solomon's temple was. This whole area, which we'll see in just a little bit, and what actually later on is going to be called, a special district or a special setting within the new city, is quite large. But this building in and of itself is not that big, because only a few people can go in it. We think about, and again, we don't have those instructions here, but we know from previous scripture, earlier scripture, that only the priest would enter in to both the nave or the sanctuary, and then the most holy place, only the high priest would ultimately go into anyway. So we've got to keep in the back of our mind, okay, never built. Okay, this doesn't actually exist. Okay, and it's not supposed to. There's purposes for this vision, which we're going to get to starting today, but it's not to show what we're going to build, okay, in that sense. And so there's elements of it, I'm curious about, but I'm not going to go too far because I know it's not built. Okay, it's not there. Unless you're a millennialist and you're waiting, okay, and you're thinking, well, it's going to be built. Good luck with that. I really don't think so, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next week or so. Okay, so looking at these structures now, we're back outside around the temple. Let's go to chapter 41, picking up in verse 5. Verse 5. Then he measured the wall of the temple, and it was 10.5 feet thick. There was a row of rooms along the outside wall. Each room was 7 feet wide. These side rooms were built in 3 levels, one above the other, with 30 rooms on each level. The supports for these side rooms rested on exterior ledges on the temple wall. They did not extend into the wall. Each level was wider than the one below it, corresponding to the narrowing of the temple wall as it rose higher. A stairway led up from the bottom level through the middle level to the top level. So there's these series of rooms on the outside, and because of the description, there seems to be a tiered effect as they're stacked, if you will, one on top of the other. 30 rooms on each level. That's the same thing we saw on the outside. There were those 30 rooms on each side. There's a lot of symmetry, okay, and we'll come back to the idea in just a little while about the perfection of this design. That's one of the key elements we want to hone in on, is that what God is showing him to convey to the people and the importance of what the imagery reflects to them, or the symbolism of it. So we've got 30 rooms on each level, or 3 levels with 30 rooms on each level. Each was wider than the other. And then in chapter 42, verses 1 through 12, there's additional information about these rooms inside them, all their measurements, and their overall structure, which, again, I'm not going to go through at this point, but you're certainly welcome to, and I wouldn't discourage you from reading that. There was a gap, and you can sort of see it, between the rooms and the temple structure itself, 35 feet wide. Huh, what a shock. All the way around. Okay, again, the symmetry of the idea, of the vision, all the way through it. Now, the purpose of these rooms, and that's what I did want to get to for just a minute. Chapter 42, verses 13 and 14. We learn about the purpose of these rooms. Then the man told me, the rooms that overlook the temple from the north and south are holy. Here the priests who offer sacrifices to the Lord will eat the most holy offerings. And because these rooms are holy, they will be used to store the sacred offerings, the grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. When the priests leave the sanctuary, they must not go directly to the outer courtyard. They must first take off the clothes they wore while ministering, because these clothes are holy. They must put on other clothes before entering the parts of the building complex open to the public. One of the reasons I think this is important, and I wanted to highlight it, is the use of these rooms, is because it provides information about a primary purpose, I think, for the vision, or it relates to the primary purpose for the exiles for Ezekiel. Distinguishing between that which is holy, that which is common. And this is in the service of the priests, is where this is emphasized several times throughout the vision, which we're going to highlight as we go through both today and into next week. That message for the people. And I'll give you a bit of a spoiler. Teaser's the opposite. A spoiler of where we're going with this. Okay, this entire vision is for them to see what their worship of God should involve, of His holiness, and a physical manifestation for them to understand this idea of separation of God in their worship. It's also a reflection of what they didn't do, okay, and why they're in exile to begin with, because of how they profaned, how they defiled His holy place, okay, that He set up with them as part of their relationship. And in part, this is, think about it. I want you to see something even grander, because God is grander. God is greater. God is holy. And that concept is going to be, well, I'm going to say drilled in, but this, if you really get into the details of this, that's what it's doing. It's emphasizing over and over God's holiness and His relationship that He wants with His people and the reverence that is due Him. Again, we pulled this thread through. God is sovereign all through this book. And His vision brings to a point some of that culmination of that, of the place of worship of God, of being in His presence. As we'll see, we've read it once, we'll read it a couple more times because it's kind of embedded again in the description that He will be with His people. And so it's talking about God with His people. And there's the implications for us, obviously, with the new covenant. And then we'll ultimately get to, very briefly, some of the connections with Revelation, because there's some very good parallels between this and Revelation. So Revelation, pulling back, as Lee's talking to us on Wednesday night, showing us from the Old Testament that understanding we can have because of the explanations we get. So from there, we have the last structural, well, no, it's not quite, 2 more structural elements. In the end of chapter 41, or in the middle, there's one more building, the West End building. And this is in chapter 41, yes, verse 12 and 15. A large building stood on the west facing the temple courtyard. It was 122.5 feet wide and 157.5 feet long. Its walls were 8 3/4 feet thick. Again, from the New Living Translation. The building to the west, including its 2 walls, was also 175 feet wide. All that's recorded in the vision is that this building was there. No explanation at all of what it was used for, its ideas. And we get that with some of the other structures in this vision, but not this one. There's just a big building. And so that's all I'm going to tell you. There's a big building. Don't have a clue what it was for. Because there's no other explanation. Okay. So 2 other elements of structure, and then we'll be done with the structure and dimensions. And we've got to jump ahead to chapter 46, and verses 19 through 24 give us the last 2 structural elements. Chapter 46, verses 19 and 20 to begin with, the cooking spaces as they're labeled. Then the man brought me through the entrance at the side of the gate to the sacred rooms facing north, which belonged to the priests, and showed me a place at the western end. He said to me, "This is the place where the priests are to cook the guilt offering and the sin offering and bake the grain offering, to avoid bringing them into the outer court and consecrating the people." Again, the illustrations aren't that great, and that's fine, but they just give us a visual sense of these other spaces that are part of this overall construction. The main idea here is that it's within the inner courtyard still, so that they would be able to do the cooking of these offerings without bringing them out where the people were, and again, not consecrating the people. Again, separation between that which is holy and that which is common. And then the final rooms we have are described in verses 21 through 24. He then brought me to the outer courts, still in chapter 46. He then brought me to the outer court and led me around to its four corners. I saw in each corner another court. In the four corners of the outer court were enclosed courts, 40 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. Each of the courts in the four corners was the same size. Around the inside of each of the four courts was a ledge of stone with places for fire built all around under the ledge. He said to me, "These are the kitchens where those who minister at the temple are to cook the sacrifices of the people." You can only see two of the corners in this illustration, but there would be another kitchen, quote unquote, in each of the other two corners that we can't see, where they would be cooking the meat. Remember, as part of the sacrificial system, the people would eat some of the offerings that they brought, some portions of the offerings that they brought. And so this is where, again, in theory, they would have been cooking those. Okay. If you go back to a few weeks ago and you put all this together, there's a lot going on. Okay, a lot of structures, a lot of dimensions, a lot of descriptions, and we haven't gone into great detail with most of it. Because my point is just to get a sense of what the people were being told, what Ezekiel was seeing and telling the people about, because that's the important thing, what they're learning from what they're hearing, which we're going to focus on in just a minute. But the final measurement, back in chapter 22, is the perimeter of the entire area, of the entire compound, if you will, on the outside, the dimensions of it. And that it begins in verse 15 of chapter 42. I don't need it. Now, when he had finished measuring the interior of the temple area, he led me out by the gate that faced east and measured the temple area all around. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 cubits by the measuring reed all around. He measured the north side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed all around. He measured the south side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed. Then he turned to the west side and measured 500 cubits by the measuring reed. He measured it on the four sides. It had a wall around it, 500 cubits long and 500 cubits broad, to make a separation between the holy and the common. And if we trust those that translate cubits to feet, it's not something I do regularly, each side was approximately 875 feet, okay, around. So a very large area altogether. And there was a wall. What was the purpose of the wall? Separation. Okay, to separate what was holy from what was common. Okay. With that point in mind, now Ezekiel's seen all this stuff, all this vision, these structures and elements, and that wall to separate that which is holy from that which is common. Ezekiel sees the magnificent sight. Okay, the return of the glory of God to the place of worship. Let's pick up in chapter 43, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 43, 1 through 9. I have some of the scriptures in my notes. I can just go through them, and the others I got to remember. All right, get your Bible out. Read it. Chapter 43. Then the man brought me to the gate facing east, and I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions I had seen by the Kebir River, and I fell face down. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. He said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The house of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings by their prostitution and their lifeless idols, and the lifeless idols of their kings at their high places. When they placed their threshold next to my threshold and their doorpost next beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them, they defiled my holy name by their detestable practices. So I destroyed them in my anger. Now let them put away from me their prostitution and the lifeless idols of their kings, and I will live among them forever. So in the previous visions, Ezekiel had seen the glory of the Lord by the Kidron River. He had seen the glory of the Lord in the temple, and he had seen the glory of the Lord depart from the temple and from Jerusalem. While we're not given a detailed explanation here, I think it's reasonable to go back as you think about those other instances, what he was seeing. Remember the living creatures, the spinning wheels with all the eyes, the platform with the throne and the vision of the fire, the man of fire, or the image that looked like the man on fire, just filling the space, just the radiance of it coming back. And so he's seeing it now for a fourth time. I made the point previously, I think in the last class, at least in my kind of twisted way of thinking, this brings Ezekiel full circle. You know, he's seen all this, the departure, the destruction, or learning of the destruction, and now the return of God coming back, coming back to the people, or bringing the people back to him. Okay, because again, this is a message to those in exile. Okay, that yes, there's been punishment, there's been destruction, there's been separation, there is going to be an unpleasant lifestyle for a while. You're not living where you want to be, but he's going to bring them back. He is going to restore them. He is going to restore them. And as I mentioned, I think previously in the class, I think that illustrates to a degree God's grace again. We're seeing even in this context his love for the people, okay, his willingness to bring them back. He's pointing out what they did in verse 8, their detestable practices. They defiled his sanctuary, his holy place. He's going to reestablish and teach them the lesson, part of it. That's why you're here. That's why Jerusalem was destroyed. That's why the temple was destroyed, because you were unfaithful. Trying to give them a sense of what this faithfulness should be like. I think that's one of the crux of the key issues that he's dealing with, again, in the message to the people and to the exiles. Because in verse 9 through 12, I think it pulls out those ideas. And I think it gives us, what I'm thinking of is probably the primary reason for the vision, at least for the exiles. What is this meaning for them? And I think it's spelled out here in these verses. So let's pick up again in verse 9, chapter 43. Now let them put away from me their prostitution and their life and the lifeless idols of their kings, and I will live among them forever. Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider the plan, and if they are ashamed of all they have done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design, and all its regulations and laws. Write these down before them so that they may be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. This is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on the top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple. Go back for just a second or two and think about the instruction Ezekiel was given at the start of this vision. Back in chapter 40, verse 4. The man said to me, Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you. For that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel everything you see. Everything you see. I think that purpose is emphasized again in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 43. Tell them. Tell them what you're seeing. Okay. So we need to think about this. This is what he's telling them. He's coming back from the vision. He comes back from the vision and explains this to them, tells them about it. What do you learn from this? Okay? Because you got to put yourself in where they're at for just a minute. You got to put aside Christ and the new covenant. I don't mean that literally, okay? Okay. But their mindset, they don't have the story. They don't know what's coming. But this is the vision they're given. And there's lessons they're supposed to learn from it. So what do you learn? Okay.
By doing what they did that led to the exile, they had profaned the temple just in their minds and in their hearts. They had taken what God had commanded and considered it just of no seriousness. God takes this seriously.
Yeah.
And he wanted them to, I guess let's do a faith check, a reality check. Do you hold on to the things that I hold dear?
Good points. Do you recognize what's important to God? We've talked briefly before, too, about the folks in exile. What was some of their mindset? I don't generalize everybody in exile was thinking so, but what was the mindset of many of those in exile? Think back to some of the lessons we've been through. Yeah. Why are we here? What did we do wrong? And there's a couple of points in the elements when the leaders come for a vision. They come for words from God. They come to Ezekiel for his prophecy, the prophecy of God through Ezekiel. And God's response to them is, why would I speak to you? Look at what you're doing, still active. Okay, going through the motions. Again, what's important to God? Well, for them it's just, well, we'll sacrifice here, but then we've got our idols right on the other side. Okay? They're still in the situation. One of the things I think they're still being told with this is what's important to God. You all are still not quite there. Okay, there's still idolatry. There is still idolatry. And not to overly simplify things, but this is the critical issue because it's where the heart and the mind is. God is not sovereign to them. They're not following his practices, designs he's given them. They're profaning him and his name, his holy divine name. Still. So part of this is stop. Reminder, stop. And part of the vision is this is what a place of worship for him, for God, this amazing structure in place that you're to come to, that is to separate, to show them again visually the idea of separation from that sin. You've got to be separate from that. Embedded in that, and we've seen this before, holiness. You've got to be holy. Be holy because I am holy. So I struggle, I'll be honest, okay, getting my head around this, of holiness. We know be separate, apart, be different. They did too. And they had some very interesting, very dramatic visual representations of this notion of being separate, of being apart, of honoring God. And they just disregarded it. And the vision that, if I forget everything else about this series, the one thing that's going to stick with me is the vision of the idolatry in the temple. To me, that's just, one, certainly terrifying, but just incredible about the different forms. And people not even, well, they do understand, not caring.
They had, in the design of this temple, a separation of the priest of Levites and the priest of Zadok.
Yeah.
Who was, of course, a Levite.
Mm-hmm.
But the salient thing of Zadok was that he was the priest that brought the Ark of the Covenant back to the sanctuary, which was the tabernacle.
Right.
David and Solomon.
Right.
When it had been profaned, it had been taken out in
Into the battle, yeah.
It was captured in battle. It was being returned.
Mm-hmm.
It was returned wrongly. It cost a life when Uriah the
Right.
reached out and touched it. And now Zadok was set apart for the bringing back of the ark. We don't have that. We're never going to see
Yeah.
or hear of the ark. And it's the glory of God that returns to this temple.
Right. Not the ark. That's a great point. Great point. That's where some of the imagery is coming to us, our understanding of our relationship with God as well, and the worship his glory. His glory. Sure. I'd be shocked if we go through Ezekiel and we weren't confused about some things. 70 years? 70 years?
I'm assuming, follow up on what Lee just said,
Mhm.
that this is not really applying to at the time that Ezekiel's receiving this. This is gonna happen when they get back to Jerusalem and they start instituting all this priestly stuff through this Zadok line, right?
In theory. And I'm not going to go too far down that road for you, but I will suggest this. Go and read Ezra. And in the very beginning of Ezra, you get his genealogy. You're going to get in about 5 or 6 names, and guess who you're going to run across? Zadok. Okay, Ezra was in the line of Zadok. Okay? And we know from Ezra he was a priest that maintained his priestly position even through the exile. Okay, through the exile. So where we're going to get to, hopefully it will alleviate some of your confusion through the rest of this morning and into next week, is, again, part of this understanding, and I'm coming this in 2 ways, okay? The message to Ezekiel and the exiles, okay? And then we'll get to messages for us. Now, we can learn from theirs too, because stop sinning, okay? Recognize the idolatry in your life. Get a grasp of holy. You're a holy people. We are a holy people. And what that means and how we live our life because of that understanding. Okay, that's important for us too. Back to your point, Richard. They're coming back to the old covenant system. Okay, when they return, they're still rebuild the temple, rebuild the wall, rebuild this city. They're coming back to Jerusalem. A remnant is. And they are going to begin again, or I guess continue, reinstall, in terms we don't lose, because they're not involved in temple worship in exile. We know that, okay? But they're going to return to that. So in part, there is a reinstitution of the covenant relationship. So you're coming back. And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. You get a second chance at this system, okay? We know the end of the story. The blood of bulls and goats is not going to get it done. Okay? And they are looking forward through other prophecies to a Messiah, but for them, they're still coming back. So as you reinstitute, as you reconstruct the temple, and you're back to that service with the descendants of Zadok being the ones ministering in the holy places, and the other priests, other family lines of the priests doing the other chores, quote unquote, my word, not in the Bible, okay, of temple service. Remember this, all where you're at, this vision, what God is desiring and directing them to do. You get a second chance. Okay, so they're going to reinstitute. So their mindset is, okay, coming back, rebuilding, trying to live accordingly to the design God has given us. That's what this next one. Describe this to the people. Describe the temple to the people. Have them consider its plan, its perfection. Mentioned a few minutes ago, the perfection of God. And that's part of what he's demonstrating for them in this vision. Again, for us, it doesn't have quite the same impact because we never saw what was there to begin with. Okay? We didn't see the first temple, the first structure, the first area. But what he's describing for them is far grander than what Solomon built in terms of the overall area and its elements. Now, when they go back, that ain't what they get. Okay, they rebuild a temple, they rebuild the wall, they have the designated areas, the courtyards, but it's not this. But the system is still in place, okay, for them, the covenant. Consider the design of the temple. More than the design, see, he's expanding this out. You got to kind of flow with it. Its regulations, its laws. The covenant. Consider that God is holy, that those in relationship with him must be holy. Go back to verse 11 of chapter 43. as you're thinking about all of this, what is it supposed to activate in them? Verse 11, and if they are ashamed of all they have done, that idolatry, that profaning, the defiling of God's holy place, of his holy name, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design and all its regulations and laws. Write these down before them so they may be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. Faithful to God. He's the designer. It's not just that big thing that he's describing. It's there. That's what I think gets the attention. But it's all of it. It's the covenant relationship he's established with them and chooses to establish with them to bring them back to. And we've made the point before in this class and other classes, they learn nothing else. They learn, let's stay away from those stone, gold, wood idols. Okay, we're not bringing those things in anymore. There was not an end to idolatry. We know that. But aspects of idolatry they did stay away from. Okay, so they learned something. But it's learning about God. And this is a more challenging approach to learning about God, I'll admit. But thinking about what his perfection. And again, his grace, his one is to bring them back. And they're coming back. A group will be coming back to worship again. That next generation needs to learn. Remember, one of the other elements of Ezra, and I'll try not to go too far out of Ezekiel when I teach particular books, one of his key tasks was to teach. Those of his line to take the word to the people, those in Jerusalem and those outside, to teach the covenant, the relationship, what they're to do to serve and worship their God, to be holy. Nothing new here. Nothing new. But they went away from it. And he's bringing them back and giving them a chance again. That's his grace to this next generation. Why are we here? Because you, and your predecessors have all defiled my name. But God is love, and he's going to bring his people back because he's true to his promise. True to his promise. True to his promises to us, which we'll see as we move forward. Oh, right at the time. Wow. Right at the time. Okay. As we begin to shift to thinking about, again, they're thinking about their relationship with God through the Old Covenant. Okay. We don't live in that. So we're going to think about this in relationship to the New Covenant and the lessons for us. And there's a really interesting way to transition through this. And again, one of those unique elements of Ezekiel, I think most people probably completely miss. Okay? And it will also give us a chance to dabble a little bit in Revelation parallels. And I'll let Lee correct me when I get things wrong on those comparisons. But in chapter 47, one of the elements, and I don't know if you've seen it in some of the other pictures. I'm not sure how well it's actually illustrated. Oh, it is there. Okay. Yeah. See, Lee cheats. He knows more about it. Is there anything in that picture that I haven't talked about at this point that you wonder what in the world is that? The river of life. There is a river flowing from this temple. And it's a very amazing feat, a very feature as it flows from this temple out. And that little ribbon of blue doesn't do justice to what this river symbolizes. So that's what we'll pick up next week. Because this is not, you cannot read that and think, oh, okay, that's literal. Can't do it. So this week, read chapter 47 about the river of life, and we'll pick up there next week. Thank you, everyone.